Today, I'm going to tell you about probably one of the most famous serial killers of all time, Jeffrey Dahmer. If any of you have easily queasy stomachs, today's case might be a little difficult for you. We're talking about all the gross, nasty stuff you can think of. Murder, sexual assault, cannibalism, you name it, it's probably in this story. I would like to preface this case by saying I won't mention any victims' names in our case today. I'm not skipping over anything intentionally, but out of respect for them and their loved ones, I just won't be putting that out there. Jeffrey Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960 to his parents Joyce and Lionel Dahmer in every serial killer's favorite getaway, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. From the jump, Jeff was an energetic and bubbly kid, but he wouldn't be this way for very long, sadly. His dad, Lionel, studied chemistry, and after graduating, he secured a job as a research chemist. Jeffrey's mom, Joyce, suffered from severe depression and needed attention all of the time. At one point, Joyce even attempted to take her own life. Well, just before Jeffrey's 4th birthday, he needed to get surgery for a double hernia. But after the procedure, he wasn't the same bubbly child he used to be. Something inside him switched. In elementary school, Jeff was really shy, just an overall reserved, timid kid, and teachers made a note of that behavior almost immediately. But Jeff had a big imagination and was curious about lots of things. Specifically, he took up an interest in insects and collecting them. And all of this seemed fine until Jeffrey moved on to roadkill. One of these animals was a dog that had been hit. Jeffrey found it, brought it back to his shed, removed its head, and kept the skull, and nailed the rest of its body to a tree. So many things here that just did not need to happen. But when you're home alone and neglected by your parents, nobody tells you what you're doing is messed up, I guess. Well, in 1966, the family packed up and moved to Doylestown, Ohio. While there, Joyce, Jeffrey's mom, was pregnant and gave birth to his baby brother. Only 2 years later, in 1968, the family moved yet again, this time to Bath Township in Summit County, Ohio. Jeffrey asked his dad what would happen to chicken bones if they were dissolved in bleach. How do you even respond? Well, Jeffrey's dad was super science-y, remember? So when Jeffrey asked him this question, he didn't think it was weird at all. In fact, he was stoked that his son was taking an interest in something. His dad showed him how to successfully bleach the chicken bones. Eventually, he would teach him how to preserve the bones entirely. When Jeffrey was in his early teens, he started drinking excessively. Around this same time, Jeffrey was discovering his sexuality. He realized that he was gay and even had a brief relationship with a boy. However, he never came out to his parents or most people. As Jeffrey progressed through high school, his grades were suffering big time. And shortly after Jeffrey graduated from high school in 1978, his parents filed for divorce. And Joyce, his mom, was awarded custody of him. Ultimately, this custody decision wouldn't matter because his mom left him alone at the family house. Now that he had secured a bachelor pad, he could start inviting guests over, specifically young guys. One day, Jeffrey saw this dude hitchhiking and was like, "Yo, do you wanna come back to my place? My parents aren't home." The dude agreed. After hanging out for a bit, the dude decided he wanted to head home. Jeffrey refused to let him leave and instead hit him over the head with a dumbbell. After he was knocked out, Jeffrey strangled him to death. This would become his first victim, which was a really thrilling and sexual experience for Jeffrey. Jeffrey dismembered the body, and using the bleach technique his dad taught him, he dissolved the flesh from the bone. Jeffrey's dad and his new fiance, we're moving on quickly, decided to make a trip up to the family house to check in with Jeffrey and see what's up. When they got there, they realized that Jeffrey's mom wasn't there and he had been living on his own the whole time. His dad looked at how Jeffrey was living and wanted him to do something with his life. He offered to cover his college tuition at Ohio State University. So Jeffrey packed up his backpack and lunchbox and headed to college. But yet again, Jeffrey didn't like school and only ended up attending for 3 months. His dad suggested he enlist in the army, to which Jeffrey agreed and did just that. During his time in the military, though, he violated 2 of his fellow soldiers. And in 1981, the military finally discharged Jeffrey. Once this happened, Jeffrey put his tail between his legs and traveled back to Ohio to live with his parents for a little bit. However, this was short-lived because Jeff's drinking was still a major issue. His dad didn't want to deal with his behavior anymore. His drinking was out of hand, he didn't have anything going for him in life, and they didn't want to watch it happen. That's why they shipped him to West Allis, Wisconsin to live with his grandmother. Jeffrey and his grandmother actually had a great relationship. He really loved her, and she was the only family member who seemed to give a shit about him. And things started shifting for Jeffrey. His attitude flipped a switch. Jeffrey then scored employment at a blood plasma center as a phlebotomist. Those are the people that poke you with needles, FYI. He kept this job for around 10 months before he was laid off. Sadly, just because he was in a better environment didn't mean he would change his ways. Jeffrey had this sick urge inside of him to take advantage of men, control them, and hurt them. To scratch this itch, Jeffrey made frequent trips to gay bathhouses. He went to hook up with men, but discovered that he didn't like it when they moved during intercourse. Because of this, he went to his doctor under the guise of, "I work really late nights and need these specific pills to cope with the odd working hours." Eventually, the owners found out what was happening and shut that shit down immediately. He was banned from ever coming back. Oddly enough, Jeffrey wouldn't kill anyone else until 9 years later. In September of 1987, Jeffrey picked up a 25-year-old guy and brought him back to his apartment to hang out, have a little drink, and that's all. Jeffrey said he had no intention of ever hurting this man. He just wanted to drug him and take advantage of him. The following day, however, Jeffrey woke up and saw that his guest was no longer alive. He went out, bought a large suitcase, and put the body inside. Then he brought the suitcase to his grandma's house and left it there for a week. So Jeffrey let about a week go by before he came back to his grandma's house and finally unzipped the suitcase. He dismembered the body, cutting the flesh from the bone and crushing the bones with a sledgehammer. He discarded the body parts, but kept the head. Jeffrey kept the head wrapped in a blanket, and after a couple of weeks, he used that bleaching technique that his father taught him to preserve the skull. But this made the skull super brittle, and it crumbled to pieces. After this event, Jeff started to seek out victims all the time, and 2 months later, he found a 14-year-old Native American sex worker. Jeffrey offered the boy $50 to pose for nude photos at his place. There, the two engaged in intimate activities. Shortly after, Jeffrey gave him strong meds and strangled him, leaving his body on the ground for a week before returning and dismembering it. His next victim he met outside a gay bar, offering him $50 to spend the night with him at his grandmother's house. He proceeded to give this 22-year-old man substances and strangle him before doing unspeakable things to his corpse and dismembering him. A couple of months later, Jeffrey tried to do the same thing to another young man, but his grandma actually came home while his victim had been medicated. Jeffrey's freaking out because 1, he has a man in the basement, 2, he had drugged this person, and 3, his grandma knew he wasn't alone. Due to all of these factors, Jeffrey decided not to kill this man. Well, a few months passed, and by September of 1988, Jeffrey's grandmother asked him to move out. Only 2 days after settling into his new home, he was caught harming a 13-year-old boy after telling him to pose for inappropriate photographs. Jeffrey's dad got him a lawyer and scheduled psychological evaluations for him as well. In court, he pleaded guilty to enticing a minor and second-degree sexual assault. He was given 5 years probation. Yeah. And after that, he moved back in with his grandma. However, only 2 months after he was convicted, this guy went to a gay bar and found his 5th victim. Apparently, Jeffrey had no intentions of hurting this guy either. We've heard this from you multiple times, and we're just not seeing any positive results. He somehow got this man back to his grandmother's place, where they engaged in adult activity. Jeff slipped him substances and strangled him. But this time was different, because instead of just waiting a week to dismember the body, the following day, Jeffrey put the body in the tub, decapitated it, and flayed the body. He thought this guy was exceptionally good looking and wanted to keep something to remember him by. So he chose to keep his head and genitalia area. He kept these in a secret stash box in his work locker, and even after he moved out of his grandma's place, he took it with him. Then, Jeffrey moved into apartment 213, and within a week of being there, he attacked yet another sex worker. His new place wasn't in the best spot in town, but it was cheap, and because of the high crime rate, he figured the police wouldn't mind if he was killing these people engaging in illegal activity. So Jeff poisoned and strangled the 32-year-old after promising him $50. He posed his corpse in different ways and took photos of him. Afterward, he dismembered his body in the bathroom and boiled his arms, legs, and pelvis in a steel kettle. He once again kept the skull and even spray painted it to use it as home decor. In June of 1990, Jeffrey struck again. This time was a 27-year-old victim whom Jeffrey put in the freezer, thinking his body wouldn't retain any moisture. Next was a 22-year-old he met outside of a bookstore. In this instance, Jeffrey only gave the guy 2 sleeping pills, which wasn't enough to totally render him unconscious. Sadly, this man would pass from Jeffrey slashing his throat. He then took pieces of his victim's flesh, boiled them, and kept them so he could eat them later. 3 weeks later, Jeffrey met another 22-year-old at a mall and convinced him to come back to his place for a couple of drinks. He used the same method he always did, but once the man was unconscious, he took a second look and realized he wasn't even attracted to the guy. But instead of not killing and dismembering this person, he did it anyway because he was scared of how the dude might react if he woke up and realized he had been drugged. But in September of 1991, Jeffrey attacked a 17-year-old using the same method he always did. He offered up $50 to pose for pictures, strangled, and mutilated their body. Jeffrey encountered a 19-year-old he lured back to his apartment. But this time, Jeffrey tried something a little different. After this victim was unconscious, he drilled a hole into his head and poured hydrochloric acid into it. This man woke up, complained of a headache, and Jeffrey decided to knock him out yet again, strangle him, and flay him. At this point, the neighbors were pissed. This new guy had moved into the building and it smelled like corpses all the time. Well, the cops showed up and were like, dude, what the hell is this smell? To which Jeffrey responded, oh man, I'm sorry. My freezer broke and everything inside went bad. That's why it smells so funky. Which they just blindly believed. On May 26, 1991, Jeffrey met a 14-year-old boy whom he lured into his apartment. This time, he brought out his drill and drilled it into this boy's frontal lobe, pouring hydrochloric acid into the hole. Oh, and in the bedroom was the body of a man Jeffrey had just killed a few days prior. Well, Jeffrey decided as this boy was knocked out to go to the bar to get a couple of drinks. But as he was walking back, he spotted the boy naked on the street talking with a group of women. The women were trying to help this teenage boy, but the cops didn't help one bit. Jeffrey assured the police that came to his apartment that he and this boy were lovers and going through a domestic dispute. To prove it, he showed them the Polaroid photos he had taken of the child. The cops were like, everything checks out here, and left. Sadly, this boy would become his next victim. And after that was a 20-year-old man he met at a bus station, and then a 23-year-old he met at a bar. These men were dismembered, parts of their bodies kept in the freezer, and their flesh boiled and eaten. Jeffrey killed 17 males, many of them kids. One summer day, Jeffrey approached a group of guys and was like, I'll give you $100 if you pose for some pictures. And one of the guys accepted. The second this guy gets back to Jeff's apartment, the smell is blatantly apparent. Jeffrey tried to handcuff him, but was only able to get one wrist. The guy waited until Jeffrey looked away, punched him in the head, and ran out the front door. He brought the cops back to the apartment, and they were in for a big surprise. Jeffrey tried to remain calm and explained to the officers that it was all a big misunderstanding, but obviously this was a crime scene. They found the Polaroid pictures of his victims, body parts everywhere in the apartment, including in the freezer, skulls displayed like trophies, and multiple corpses in the massive drum he put in the corner of his room. Jeffrey Dahmer was arrested in 1991 and in court tried to plead insanity. However, the jury saw right through all his BS. He eventually confessed to 17 murders spanning from 1978 to the 1990s. He was sentenced to 15 life terms. Jeffrey was placed in the Columbia Correctional Institute in Portage, Wisconsin. 2 years into his multiple life sentences, he was killed by a fellow inmate in the gymnasium during cleaning duty. Jeffrey Dahmer was 34 years old. And that, my friends, is the absolutely insane story of Jeffrey Dahmer. What did you all think about this case? I'm sure you've heard about it before, but there are so many details that there's always something horrible to find. I'm Brandi. Thanks for watching Killer Bites. I'll see you next time.